Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So I'm still in Petworth Park in West Sussex, but I've moved under the trees because the sun, it's getting near midday and the sun is really beating down hot, so my pale English skin can't take it. So I'm still looking at questions that have been asked on the Facebook page, Scholar Facebook page, link below. And the first question I'm going to address in this video is from Jim Howard. And Jim Howard says, and this is actually a common question I get asked, of all the Sabre sources known to us, what would you recommend as being the best for teaching new students? And what would you say is the best source material overall? If they're different, how would you explain the disparity? Okay, so I don't have one answer to that. Okay, the fact is, actually, once you get into the 19th century, particularly the late 19th century, there are lots of really good manuals. Now, I know a lot of people would recommend Roworth, for example. My personal issue with Roworth is I don't think it's well enough illustrated, and I think that for a beginner, or for anyone really, even if you're experienced in HEMA but Sabre is a new weapon to you, pictures are really super useful. Okay, 1,000 words, you know. So personally, I always recommend Broadsword and Single Stick by Allinson, Wynne and Phillips. I'll put a link to that below because it is available online. I'm lucky enough to own an original copy of that actually, and you can buy facsimile copies off Amazon as well. And I highly recommend that as an overall, because it gives you a section on the sword and then a section on the single stick, but they're sort of interrelated. I would also frankly recommend all of Hutton's works. I know that Hutton's Cold Steel manual gets a bit of a bad rap these days, and I think some of the people who do Italian Sabre don't like it because they see it as a sort of bastardized version of what they do, and in a sense it was partly based on Parisi and partly based on another Italian master I can't remember the name of. You know, I think that Hutton's books are good, so look up not so much Cold Steel, I would say the Swordsman personally. So I would say look at the Swordsman and look at the foil and the sabre sections in the Swordsman. Okay, so look at Hutton's The Swordsman, look at Allinson, Wynne and Phillips Broadsword and Single Stick, and once you've looked at those, this is obviously British stuff because this is mostly what I know, and I'll come around to the other stuff in a minute. And then once you've looked at those, then you can look at loads of other sources, and the more other sources you look at, the more clarity it will add to the original ones you're looking at, and to the overall kind of art, because most of the British treatises are interrelated in some way, and they might vary between teachers and they might vary by time, but there's a lot of common features to them. They all attack on the lunge and they all use very similar footwork, they use similar, most of them use similar numbered cuts, and obviously my own main source for working from is John Musgrave Waite, Lessons in Sabre. And it's actually got a very long title, but Lessons in Sabre is the shortened title, from 1880. And but I would recommend reading Waite after you've read Hutton and Allinson, Wynne and Phillips, simply because Waite, I won't say it's an advanced source, but he doesn't explain some of the basics. He just assumes you already know those. That's my opinion anyway. And incidentally, for anyone who doesn't know, I am actually working on a Sabre book myself, but it's based on Waite's works and a couple of other related works to his own. So that would be my answer. And you know, in terms of the foreign kind of non-British, shall we say, kind of treatises, I would say that there's so Chris Holtzman has got a very good book on the Italian dueling sabre. If you want to get a modern book and practice a military sabre system, then have a look at Chris Holtzman's Art of the Dueling Sabre. As he himself says, he called it Art of the Dueling Sabre partly for marketing reasons. The dueling sabre and the military sabre are kind of not separate things in Italy at that period. So it is a military sabre system, but it must be said that the Italians did use, by British standards, lighter gymnasium sabres. So for example, in 1890, if you were practicing sabre fencing, you could get an Italian style gymnasium sabre that would weigh about 700 grams, or you could get a British one that would weigh about 800 grams, but they're balanced differently. The Italian one's balanced very near the hilt, and the British one's balanced further up the blade. So there we go. In terms of so what would I say is the best material overall? I can't really answer that. I mean, there's great Swedish, German, Italian, Spanish, Mexican, American, Russian. There's loads of different sabre sources, and I haven't studied them all, so I'm not in a position to say which is the best, and so therefore I can't really answer the last part of Jim Howard's question. But anyway, let's have a look at another couple of questions. So Mitch Cleghorn asks a question that I think I can answer relatively quickly, but also fairly vaguely, unfortunately. Do you think the evolution of the sabre across Europe was more driven by fashion trends or function? Both. The fact is that you can use sabres in a way in Europe didn't suddenly appear like lots of people think they do, and like some books explain that they did. The fact is the hanger, so that what's essentially a short sabre, like the Langmesser, had been around since the 15th century. And in fact, we know in some cases that what we would describe as sabres, the early Kilich, for example, found its way into Europe as well, certainly into Eastern and Central Europe, and in some cases let's say Islamic sabres were brought back to France and Britain from people's travels as well. So the fact is that we know that sabres were in Western Europe earlier. They are great weapons, they function perfectly well. If we look at the Napoleonic era, for example, let's say the 1780s and 1790s, when there was a move from what we would call back swords, so straight single-edged swords, to sabres, curved single-edged swords, and there was a change in the hilt style. There are some functional benefits to sabres in that they don't have such large bulky guards as earlier basket hilts do. A curved blade has some benefits in cutting, particularly for cavalry, although at the detriment slightly of thrusting. So I think the simple answer is both. There's no question that fashion played a part, because the Austro-Hungarian, the Hussars, their uniforms were adopted by Western forces in, Spain and France and Britain and Portugal and Netherlands and wherever. Absolutely, sort of Central and Eastern European fashions were brought over into the west of Europe and America. So that's true, and definitely the styles of sword, therefore, were associated with that. But equally, that doesn't mean that they're not perfectly fine swords. People in Hungary had been using sabres since the 14th, 15th centuries, perhaps even earlier. Yeah, in fact, definitely earlier. They had sabres going all the way back to Charlemagne's time, didn't they? But they, yeah, so basically the whole medieval period in Hungary and parts of Central and Eastern Europe, they had sabres. So there's nothing wrong with sabres. Just because you copy something because of fashion doesn't ergo mean that it's not also perfectly functional as well. I think that kind of answers the question. Let's have a look at another question now. So the final question for this video, and I think probably for this series, because I have to be heading off now, is from Luke Doran. And Luke Doran says, was there much difference in the way battlefield swordsmanship was taught compared to dueling or tournament fighting historically? And does modern HEMA more closely resemble one or the other, if so? Well, essentially there's no difference, okay? So as far as we can tell, like pretty much all of the, except where there's a specific judicial dueling background or a specific dueling, like first blood type background, pretty much all of the fencing treatises are just teaching you how to use a sword. It doesn't matter whether it's self-defense, whether it's a duel, or whether it's on the battlefield as a last-ditch thing. In any situation, how you use a sword is pretty much similar, and it's more dictated by whether you're both unarmoured, whether one or both of you have armour, what type of weapons are involved, if it's an asymmetrical match, if it's sword versus spear or sword versus sword. So it's more dictated by things like those, but like that. And really, when you come to battlefield training, we actually don't see individual weapon use really very much outside of teaching the individual how to manage their weapon and then teaching them how to function as part of a large unit. So if we go to the 19th century, for example, which is the most well documented period really for HEMA sources, we see bayonet training done with one person against one person, despite the fact that you're never going to have a duel with bayonets, you're never going to have a tournament. Well, you usually don't have a tournament with bayonets. It did happen, in fact. But what they're teaching you is just how to use your bayonet, how to management of your weapon. And then once you manage your weapon, then you get taught how to function as a unit. And actually functioning as a body of troops is more about coordination, how to march, how to maneuver, how to wheel, how to listen to commands, how to get into a position to receive cavalry or to receive other infantry, change formation quickly because you've come under fire from artillery, how to use the lay of the land, how to hide behind things and build fortifications, how to take fortifications, how to attack someone who's on the top of a wall. If you look at the bayonet manuals, they've even got thrusts for stabbing someone in a trench and stabbing someone on a wall. So they're not really different things. You learn how to use your weapon, and then you learn how to function with a body of troops. And if all that body of troops know how to use their weapon, then good, then they know how to use it within the group as well. Now there are some specific types of tactics which were taught allegedly before the Battle of Culloden. British troops were told to stab to their right so that it bypassed the Highlanders' targes. Whether this is true or not, I've not really been able to find a lot of source material for this, and whether this is true or not, I don't really know. It could be one of those urban myths, but that's an example of training where, okay, you know how to use your bayonet, you know how to march, you know how to make formations. Now we're going to teach you a specific technique for fighting in a group. And there's actually very little evidence for that, and there are very few things in any sorts of manuals or treatises written about that type of stuff. There are a very few sources out there that mention in passing that stuff like this was taught sort of word of mouth, you know, person to person on campaign, or the commander said, I want all of you men, now I want all of you to do this, and so they did it. You know, famously, for example, at the Battle of Waterloo, certain cavalry commanders ordered their men to thrust and to not cut and things like this. So very specific orders for a specific engagement against a specific opponent. I think that's the answer, and you can't necessarily prepare for that. A lot of people have asked me, did British infantry in the 1870s and 80s, were they trained to fight against Zulus, for example? Because it's a very particular type of opponent, someone with a large shield and an assegai. It's very different from the normal bayonet versus bayonet training that they received. And as far as I can see, no, they didn't receive any special training. Ironically, what they were taught to do at Culloden, thrust to this side, would work against Zulus, okay, because it would bypass the Zulu shield of the person in front of you and stab the Zulu to the side. So there are things like this you could adapt quickly for a specific opponent or a specific scenario. But generally speaking, as far as swordsmanship is concerned, you just teach a person how to use a sword, and then they have to adapt their tactics to the scenario that they're fighting in. Anyway, thanks very much for sending in all these questions. I've really appreciated it, and if I haven't answered your question in one of the previous videos, or in this one, then I may possibly answer your question in a future one, or it might just be because I don't know the answer, but maybe I'll learn the answer in the future. Anyway, thanks for watching, folks, and if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Give us a like, and our Facebook page is linked below here. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks!